Hello and welcome to the sixth of 8 presentations in the 2021 Great Decisions Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. And we're so glad to have you with us today for this joint presentation with the U.S. Heartland China Association. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events, information on joining a Great Decisions group and ordering 2022 materials, and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. For decades, the annual Great Decisions Briefing Book has framed informed civil discussions about critical international issues. Groups around the country, including here in the Kansas City metro area, meet in coffee shops, conference rooms, and now virtually to explore these issues together and distill policy recommendations and future outlooks. To support their exploration and to bring the larger community into the discussion, the IRC is proud to offer a series of conversations with respected experts through 2021 on the year's 8 Great Decisions topics. We warmly welcome diverse perspectives and invite your engagement with these foreign policy issues from work, from home, or wherever you might be. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore the trajectory of globalization. We know that many in the audience have already discussed this topic with their local Great Decisions group, so we certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Great Decisions lecture series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming months. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Great Decisions lecture series possible. In particular, thanks to sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and supporting series sponsor Nancy C. Messer. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. We're especially pleased to be presenting this conversation with the U.S. Heartland China Association. USHCA's Executive Director and friend of the International Relations Council, Min Fan, will serve as moderator for today's program. Prior to joining USHCA, Min had a successful career as an innovation leader in the corporate world and has led nonprofit organizations with a focus on promoting understanding between the US and China. As Executive Director of USHCA, Min is responsible for strategic direction and execution of this growing nonprofit, which is becoming a unique voice in the US-China relations space. Min, we're so grateful to you and your team for your help in making this program possible and for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. First of all, congratulations to the IRC community and the state of Missouri for having such a wonderful organization that's providing such great resource to the state and the people. But I want to first actually turn to your former governor, Bob Holden, who's actually our chairman and CEO. Without Governor Holden's leadership, U.S. Heartland China Association would not be able to continue to champion advocating for productive U.S.-China relationship. So now let me turn to Governor Holden to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, man. I'm delighted to be with everybody this evening. Matt, thank you for all of your leadership, and great to see Dave Dollar with us tonight. He's a Brookings fellow and truly is someone that is a world leader in this discussion. We couldn't have anybody better. You know, I feel quite at home this evening because I was born in Kansas City, but raised on the Kansas side for a while before I moved into Southern Missouri. So I feel very, very comfortable with all of my colleagues today. Tonight, we're going to have a very serious and thoughtful discussion. The president plays such an important role in the topics that we're going to be debating now, and they're debating in Washington, D.C. every day. But we had 2 individuals from our region that truly laid the foundation for much that's been done since 1945 and beyond. And that's Harry Truman, who was president of the United States from independence, and Dwight Eisenhower, who was from Kansas, And both of these men really developed a strategy and an approach to how we as a country could move forward in the years ahead and be successful. We need more of that discussion with us today, and I look forward to the people speaking tonight because I know they will address those issues. We need to find strategies that figure out a way so it's to our advantage to do, it's also for China's advantage to do, to be successful. If we try to pit each other against each other, then I'm fearful that neither one of us will be as successful as we'd like to be going forward. Question is, how do we work together? How do we build the coalitions that show both sides of the equation, the benefit of what we're doing and what we're seeking? So that comes down to what Dave Dollar will, I'm sure, speak on tonight. How do we put the pieces in place so we can work together like Harry Truman did and Dwight Eisenhower when they brought the world together through the UN and through the different alliances? We need to do that again in the world that we're in today. And I look forward to this discussion with some of the best people in the world having the talk.
Thank you, Governor Holden. And as Governor Holden and Matthew mentioned before, we are so lucky to have Dr. David Dollar with us today. And Dr. David Dollar is a senior fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution and host of the Brookings Trade podcast, Dollar&Sense. He's a leading expert on China's economy and U.S. China economic relations. From 2009 to 2013, Dr. Dollar was the U.S. Treasury's economic and financial emissary to China, based in Beijing, facilitating the macroeconomic and financial policy dialogue between the United States and China. Prior to joining Treasury, Dr. Dollar worked 20 years for the World Bank, serving as country director for China and Mongolia, based in Beijing. And I can go on and on with this bio, but I know we're all looking forward to hearing Dr. Dollar's explanation and question analysis of the big question is, are we seeing the end of globalization? So with that, I'll turn to Dr. Dollar.
Thank you very much, Min Fan, for the warm introduction. Really great to be joining this program. I'm happy that Governor Holden started with the reference to Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. I was just looking at some opinion survey data about the popularity of presidents. It was a little article about our current president, where he stands after a few months, comparing him to previous presidents. And the thing that struck me is Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower were remarkably popular for most of their tenure with 80% approval. We just never see that anymore. Nobody gets 80% approval. So it's interesting that these two presidents came from the heartland of the United States, and they played a critical role in developing the institutions of globalization. And they convinced American people that this was in the country's interest, and they really took the lead. So a great way to start. Thank you, Governor. Now, the organizers for this program, the topic, is this the end of globalization? This is a very, very big topic. We could take it in a lot of different directions. The organizers sent me a long list of questions, and I put them into a couple of buckets. And I agreed with Min that I would just take two of those from my prepared remarks, so we leave most of the time for Q&A. So I'm deliberately leaving a lot of very contemporary policy discussions. What should we do about U.S. China trade? I'm leaving that deliberately for the dialogue part of the program on the assumption that Min or someone is going to bring that up. But I want to cover two things which I think are really critical background. First, broad question of, why is globalization so controversial, and particularly in the U.S.? It is frankly more controversial in the U.S. than it is in much of the rest of the world, Europe, for example, or a lot of the developing world. And then the second topic I want to take up is China's role in globalization, which sets the stage for some of our current policy issues. So first, on why globalization is controversial. First, there are a lot of different elements to globalization, but I think the most important are foreign trade and foreign investment, which are very closely interrelated. And in general, foreign trade and foreign investment make countries richer. That's why just about everybody pursues that. But what we often neglect to emphasize is that there are winners and losers from free trade and open investment. And the logic of this is pretty straightforward. Free trade, in particular, enables countries to make use of factors of production that they have in great abundance. And I'll give a couple examples to make that concrete. A great example for this discussion is America has a large amount of farmland. We could produce much more food than we could ever eat. So we have an abundance of farmland, and trade enables us to export a lot of that product. If we couldn't trade, then we would have to decommission a lot of the land under agriculture. People would have to leave the sector, farm prices, food prices would go down. So farmers are one of the winners of globalization in the United States, because this is one of the factors where we have abundance. The other obvious one is that we are the technological leader in the world in many, many different sectors. I saw a recent estimate that for our Standard & Poor's 500, which is basically the 500 biggest companies in the US, 90% of their value, their market capitalization, corresponds to patents, brands, what we call intangible property or intellectual property. So American companies are successful and wealthy, not because they own stuff, but because they have patented or trademarked ideas. And so globalization is an opportunity, to just take a simple example like Apple. They have all these great patents that they use to make products. Globalization allows them to essentially double their market. I think about half of their sales are in the US, half of their sales are in the rest of the world. If you didn't have trade, they'd lose half of the benefit from their intellectual property. And because the global market, enables you to earn so much from your intellectual property, of course, that increases the incentives to innovate. Recently, we had this remarkable development of the COVID-19 vaccines in record time. The Pfizer vaccine does not have any particular government subsidy behind it. It was just driven by private market incentives. And I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure that having a world market increased the incentives for the pharmaceutical companies to create successful vaccines, because not only can they sell them in the United States, but of course they're selling them globally. So globalization enables the innovative firms to earn more from their results, and it increases the incentives. So, as we've integrated in the world economy, in general, we've seen faster technological development, faster productivity growth. Let me just give one other concrete example, because we have some very skilled workers in the US. So you take a firm like Boeing Aircraft, which employs a large workforce of mostly very skilled workers, I think in every one of the 50 states of the United States. Again, they sell about half of their output overseas. So if we didn't have international trade, then Boeing would essentially have to cut back its activity by 50%. So you can identify quite a few specific winners in the United States from globalization. Now, there are also losers. And it's increasingly clear, I think, that manufacturing workers in the United States have lost out, because given the abundances I talked about for the US, then you look at much of the rest of the world, the developing world, the main thing that's abundant would be what I call semi-skilled labor. That is labor with roughly a high school education, literacy, numeracy. Those are the basic skills you need to work in most manufacturing that not the skilled crafts, but the semi-skilled production work. So as we've integrated, you've got a vast world of semi-skilled workers out there working at low wages. And here capital mobility comes in very importantly. You might think American workers would be benefiting from the technology that American firms have created and own. But in today's world, it's very easy for American firms to take the technology and produce elsewhere. Apple, in fact, does not own any production facilities anywhere. Apple contracts mostly with a Taiwanese company based in the mainland China to produce laptops, tablets, smartphones based on Apple's technology patents, et cetera. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of workers in China working on the production of Apple products. It's hard to argue that any American workers are getting a direct benefit by the fact that Apple has this technological lead in its field. It's the semi-skilled workers in the US, and it's not just manufacturing because there's competition across sectors. So in general, semi-skilled workers in the US have basically seen their real compensation flat or declining for several decades. And as this process eliminates some jobs, in many cases, you had manufacturing firms in the US that were the big employer in a particular city or town. And then as you move the factory abroad, the whole town is devastated. So we have lots of examples in the old industrial heartland, around Pittsburgh and into Ohio, continuing up toward Illinois, Michigan, et cetera, but also New England. New England used to be a major manufacturing center. So we do have a lot of distressed parts of the United States. And so this is sort of my brief explanation of why this is so controversial. It's good for the economy as a whole, but the benefits tend to go to certain groups, which I've emphasized. And on the other hand, you've got clear losers, and those losers are unhappy about the whole process. So it's become quite controversial in the United States. So that's really the first point I wanted to make. Now, the second issue I wanted to take up is China's role in globalization. China is the country, for the moment, it still has the largest population in the world. India will overtake it fairly soon, but China has been the most populous country. Up until Deng Xiaoping's leadership, starting around 1978, China was extremely isolated, cut off from the world economy, not involved in international trade. And then China started opening up under Deng Xiaoping, first very, very gradually, but then after 1992, this accelerated. And among investment bankers, when I give a talk to investment bankers, I've noticed there's this shorthand that people often refer to China's emergence as doubling the world's labor supply. Because as China emerged, it had more workers than all of the advanced economies combined. So the United States, Europe, Japan combined, roughly in the same ballpark as the number of workers in China. So all of a sudden, this huge country comes into the world system, liberalizes trade, starts attracting foreign investment, joins the World Trade Organization, and they've got this vast population which has basic education. They had done a good job with literacy and numeracy, but China did not really have much else. It's a resource-poor country. It has only 7% of the world's arable land. So it's natural for China to import food, which they do from the United States and others. They had virtually no technology as they started to open up. So they welcomed direct foreign investment, and they became the largest recipient of direct foreign investment among developing countries. So that, it was an opportunity for firms, international firms, to come take advantage of their technological prowess in the Chinese market, hire large numbers of workers at very, very low wages. And this was frankly quite a positive thing for China, because they had literally had hundreds of millions of destitute farmers. And as I said, very little arable land. And in that situation, the farmers started moving to the city. Eventually, about 300 million people moved. You know, the numbers in China are always very large. And China became a manufacturing powerhouse, where its role initially was very much focused on the most labor-intensive assembly. So products like footwear and garments, also toys, some of the simple parts of electronics. But over time, workers' skills improved. You began to get genuine Chinese private sector firms that could supply certain inputs. And so China has gradually moved up the value chain. So it's producing more in the, not just the most labor-intensive assembly, but it's producing quite a bit of what I think of as the intermediate technology level inputs, et cetera. So frankly, globalization is much less controversial in China than it is in the US, because it's clearly contributed to this process of rapid urbanization. The people who move from the countryside to the cities, their incomes go up immediately. And what we've seen in China is this unprecedented poverty reduction. Using the World Bank's poverty line, about 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty during economic reform. And interestingly, it's not just China. If you look around the developing world to India, and even now some parts of Africa, we've actually seen unprecedented poverty reduction during this modern era of globalization. So one of the best arguments in favor of globalization is it's created an environment in which developing countries can thrive and develop. But these topics are linked. You can see how this then imposed a challenge on certain parts of the American workforce and certain communities around the United States. Now, China's benefited enormously from this globalization process, but I would say nobody's completely satisfied with the outcomes and underlying the policies that essentially make up globalization. So on the US side, there's a lot of concern about hollowing out of the middle class and communities that have been devastated, very legitimate concerns. In China, I think the mirror image of that, especially in the early part of this process I described, is you had a lot of worry in China, that China was always going to be left with just these relatively minor, low-paying assembly occupations, that China would not develop its own firms, would not move up the value chain. Now, as I said, we've scrolled ahead a couple decades, and China has clearly moved into the middle of a lot of value chains. And I think a lot of that just happens naturally, what we call learning by doing. So a Chinese firm starts out doing some very simple products for foreign investors with facilities in China. And then they learn, oh, okay, you could actually use something that's a little more sophisticated. Lots of examples where the multinationals, the international firms, essentially kind of feed back into the domestic economy and stimulate innovation among firms to start supplying more sophisticated parts and components. So we've clearly seen that in China, but we've also seen fairly aggressive government actions trying to speed up this process. So we have lots of documented cases of cyber theft of technologies, for example, where the Chinese government is trying to identify key technologies and give these to Chinese firms. I've emphasized China has been very open to foreign investment, but that's often been quite uneven There's certain sectors that are open, foreign investment is welcome, but then there are other areas that might be closed off. For example, they closed off the construction of high-speed passenger rail in China, kept the international firms out, essentially stole technology from some major international firms that do high-speed rail, and built up their own industry. Now, let me say that everyone who's industrialized has done some of this along the way. The US did this with the United Kingdom back around 1790, stealing textile technology. So I think an important part of the debate now is, is China doing this on an unprecedented scale, especially now with the role of the internet and cyber attacks? Is this a much more serious problem or threat? Plus, now that China's become the second biggest economy in the world, reasonable chance that China will be the biggest economy in the world in, say, 10 years, you have a lot of worry in the US that China may someday be a military adversary. And so then you start thinking, okay, it was one thing when Japan was doing some of these things that I just discussed. They're a close ally of the US since the end of World War II. Do we feel the same way as if China is appropriating US technology, given the nature of the Chinese regime and the fact that there may be military, I'd hate to say military conflict, but there's certainly potential for the US and China to be military adversaries. So I think in China, the worry about globalization is that China will be too dependent on foreign technology, particularly American technology, that it won't move up swiftly enough to develop its own technologies, its own brands. In the US, we're worried about the hollowing out of the middle class and communities that are left behind. These are very legitimate concerns. And I think in the Q&A, in the moderated dialogue, probably first with Min Fan, we'll get a little bit more into some of the specific policy issues between the United States and China. But I think that, that's the complex background. So we've still got more to cover, but let me just say as a preliminary marker at this point, in both the US and China, globalization is seen as having a lot of benefits and also some costs and problems. I think the tendency is to try to fix the problem and keep globalization. So as far as the question, have we reached the end of globalization? I don't think so, okay? But it's a good issue to debate. And now I want to turn things back to Min.
Thank you, Dr. Dollar. One of the first questions, we already have audience questions, but please feel free. One of the first questions that we had part is that a lot of the question about globalization is domestically driven because we have benefited tremendously. So would you please maybe survey the current economic situation in the United States and what kind of domestic priorities we have and how likely that US will continue to grow as the major power, because that will determine how we actually evaluate a lot of issues, right? So yeah, please, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so thank you. So as I said right at the beginning, this is such an enormous topic. There are a lot of directions one could go. I chose not to delve into the COVID-19 pandemic. That's obviously an aspect of globalization. The disease came out of China, spread around the world pretty quickly. We had a similar flu in 1919 when the world was much less integrated. So I don't really think there was ever a realistic chance to prevent the spread of COVID-19, no matter how little or how much globalization we had. But it's obviously had a devastating effect on the US economy. Now we're bouncing back, but with the virus tends to come and go in waves. And so I think there's still some nervousness about the exact trajectory of this comeback. But beyond that, as a kind of a short-term issue, I'm pretty optimistic about the US economy. I mean, it's easy to get pessimistic because of our politics, and I'm part of a nonpartisan think tank. I'm just talking about paralysis in Washington. But we do occasionally we get nice surprises. The two parties endorse this infrastructure bill, which I think will ultimately get signed into law and will do quite a bit. And I think some other things will get put into place. But fundamentally, I'm optimistic about the US because I think we are still a very innovative economy, innovative society. And despite the kind of hand-wringing, I think we're going to essentially maintain our involvement in globalization. I do feel like we're missing some opportunities. We'll probably get into this a little bit more, Min, but we could be out there pursuing new trade agreements to expand globalization, and we're not doing that. We're kind of in a stasis of, we seem to lack our self-confidence to go out and negotiate new agreements, but we're not really backing away. We've got these tariffs on China, 25% on about half of our imports. That's moderately serious, but frankly, firms have been able to get around that pretty easily. It hasn't been that disruptive either in China or in the United States. So I think as long as we're not increasing the protection, I think that our foreign trade investment will continue to increase. I just don't see us pushing forward as much as we could in terms of new agreements.
Great, thank you. We have an audience question from Jeff Zhang. Ambassador Lighthizer recently wrote a guest column in The Economist advocating the use of tariffs to correct structural deficits facing the United States. How serious is the problem of trade/investment deficits? Is taxing imports a better way to tackle this problem than ramping up domestic investment by taxing corporate wealth?
So I did see that article, and I have to say that this is a very powerful theorem in economics that you can't really make a major adjustment in the trade balance through import tariffs. You might think that if you put import tariffs on, that reduces imports, so that has to improve your trade balance. But the powerful theorem in economics is that it also discourages your exports. And even if you don't like theory, we have a number of historical examples. The best being in the 1930s, we put very steep tariffs on products because we were worried about a trade deficit, and our exports went down more than our imports, and our trade deficit went up. So in general, it's not a successful instrument as far as reducing the trade balance. And I think one of the reasons why that's true is that the underlying cause of a trade balance is low savings. And most economists are not that worried. The level of deficit the US has, it always sounds like a big number because we're so big. But I think the broadest measure is down around 2 to 3% of US GDP. And that's frankly just not really a big issue. It is an indication we're borrowing from abroad to the tune of about 3% of GDP every year, but our GDP is going up in nominal terms faster than that. So external debt relative to GDP is not going up. It's not a big problem. It's not worrisome. But if you were going to worry about it, then you have to face the fact that the solution is to cut American consumption. That's the only solution. And so I don't think that'll be politically popular at all. And I don't think it's necessary. But if you want to cut the trade deficit, you need to cut consumption. We'd have to raise taxes, for example. Like European countries tend to have a value-added tax, which is like a sales tax on everything. If we put a steep value-added tax in on everything, and by the way, then you can't spend it. To make it savings, you have to raise the revenue, not spend it, so your fiscal deficit goes down, and then your trade deficit will tend to go down as well. Okay, so I'm just not that worried about it. I don't think American people want to cut their consumption.
Right. Well, thank you. I think there's a related question about the major outcomes of removing debt ceiling. I know it might sound like a detour, but related.
Oh, no, these are all really great questions. I mean, I have to say, I'm of the school, including Janet Yellen was my Brookings colleague before she became Treasury Secretary. I totally agree with her. We should get rid of the debt ceiling because it's Congress that decides on spending and Congress sets the taxes. And they have, under both types of administrations, Republican and Democratic, they have mostly set taxes and spending. So we run a deficit, and that accumulates over time to debt. And so now the only issue is, are we going to honor our debts? And the debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling does not authorize any new spending. It's just servicing the debts that we've already accumulated. $8 trillion under President Trump, frankly, 8 trillion of new debt under President Trump. And 3 times Congress raised the debt limit. It wasn't controversial. So I just don't understand why now it's controversial. You can argue about whether, we should cut spending, raise taxes. That's a legitimate argument. But whatever the Congress does, then we should pay our bills. And that's what raising the debt ceiling is about.
Dr. Eller, one thing I really appreciate when you mentioned is that you are very optimistic about the US economy if we get away from the politics, right? So I think that's another thing that related to the debt ceiling discussion. Another question that came up was about the next stage of globalization. You mentioned about there are winners and losers. There's always effort to try to make it fair. And you were a member of one of the global institutions. And they've been questioning about, are they still relevant? Are they still able to solve the problem? What do you see as the next stage and what will be required of the institution to facilitate that?
Well, you'll be amused to know that my part of the institution had a annual retreat this morning virtually. And one of the things we decided was that we needed to get out and talk to real people in America. We needed to get out of Washington and go out and, talk to people in Kansas City, Missouri, and the Heartland, et cetera. And I do a little bit of this, but I'm going to make an effort to do more. But of course, we have to be listening too. So I'm happy to talk to the group, but I need to get out and listen to what ordinary people's concerns are about. I do think we have lots of different types of international institutions. Some nonprofit like Brookings, others part of the UN system like the International Monetary Fund. I do worry that all of these institutions have got a little bit distant from ordinary people. And it would be good to just spend more time listening and thinking about, what are the prime concerns yeah.
Great. So if you have to come to a Rust Belt city who's struggling and to come out with maybe a trade policy for the workers or something that really make a difference in their life, is there such solution out there, or just sounds good right now?
Well, see, my honest, I worry about the people who've been hurt by globalization, and I would be happy to do something about it. And I personally would be happy to pay more taxes to get it done. But I honestly do not think that you can use trade policy in any easy way. The obvious attempt would be to protect, certain, to have higher tariffs and to protect certain industries. I just think the historical experiences, it doesn't end up protecting the workers. We've had a number of cases in America, aside from the generalized tariff in the 1930s, we've had several cases where we've tried to protect particular industries. And what it's done is it's given the firms a little bit of breathing room, and then they've taken their plants and moved to another country. And it doesn't end up saving jobs for workers. So I really don't think you can use trade policy to protect particular jobs. I think we need to the improvement would be more in proactive policies to retrain workers, to help people move to new places. It's very complicated because all these things are interconnected. Yeah. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm impressed by the articles I read about how difficult it is to build new housing in a lot of California, for example. You know, despite anything you might have heard, you know, California economy is doing fine, but in a lot of places, housing prices have become insane, and it's really hard to build new units. So it may just be that if you could build new housing, multi-family housing in California, apartments, et cetera, you know, that could help, you know, ease some bottlenecks. And in general, I've worked on rust belts in China and other places too, by the way. So you have similar issues. And, you know, in general, local governments don't like to be told that part of the solution is that some of their people should probably move away. But in some cases, a modest amount of outmigration, you know, actually leaves the remaining population with sufficient resources and opportunities. And so, you know, you need a kind of integrated plan, but you know, we're America. I mean, people are going to keep moving around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. We have an audience question. Many political scientists argue that an era of globalization ended at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Politics and war killed it. Some metrics of global trade would not recover for 80 years. Do you think that's a good comparison with globalization 2.0?
I think it's a great point and a great question. You know, between 1870 and about 1914, there was a remarkable first wave of modern globalization through trade liberalization, improvements in steamships and telegraph, et cetera. And, you know, the elite at that time were kind of riding high, and the notion was you couldn't possibly turn back globalization. And then, you know, then we had this terrible World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So I think we have to take seriously, you know, that there is that globalization is fragile. You know, it needs proactive support. It touches back a little bit on, I think a question we had earlier that, or at least, you know, part of my earlier answer, that I don't see the U.S. kind of proactively pushing for new, larger trade agreements. And maybe the best we can hope for at this moment is a kind of stasis or, you know, stability. But I worry about that, because I think if we're not going forward, then it's easy for some kind of exogenous event like COVID-19, some kind of environmental disaster. It's easy to think of things that could push us backwards. And then, you know, and then worst case, some kind of war between the US and China, that would put an end to modern globalization.
That seemed to kind of relate to one of the questions about what future do you see for trade blocs and free trade agreements, and what do Brexit and the transition from NAFTA to USMCA indicate about where globalized economies are heading?
Right. So I was a fan of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not every aspect of it, but I think in general, the notion of getting a like-minded group of countries to address what I think of as modern issues, intellectual property rights protection, trade and services, disciplining state enterprises. The whole agenda was built kind of with China in mind, but China was not part of the negotiating group. But then, you all know the story. We pulled out, and President Biden hasn't shown any interest in getting back in. And meanwhile, China has now applied. So I actually think further trade agreements are going to be very important. And China's got a new one with ASEAN, the nations of Southeast Asia. And now it's applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's negotiated an investment deal with Europe. So China's out there making new agreements, setting the rules of trade and investment, and they may not all pan out. China is often its own worst enemy, but it's trying. to make these trade and investment agreements, and the US is not interested. To be frank, I don't think the MCA was not any big step forward on NAFTA. In some areas, it was a step back, but not a big change. And then Brexit, is the UK equivalent of some of this angst that we have in the US, saying that, being part of the European Union, it's a big bureaucracy setting rules. We don't want that. And now the UK is economically going to be suffering quite a bit. So I do worry about, obviously I worry about these isolationist trends, and, I don't wish anyone ill, but I think they're going to lead to bad outcomes.
So we talk about, if we keep politics aside, we can be more optimistic, but we can't keep politics aside. And from the history you mentioned, referred to, it seems like the economic undercurrent will come up as nationalism, isolationism, and then that will impact. So where do you see we're at the cycle? Are we living through the consequence of policies made 20 years ago that it will have to work its way out? What are your thoughts on that?
As I get older, Min, I'm willing to accept that I know less than I thought I knew. Okay. So I say that because I would say there's a pretty intense debate in Washington, and this is a relevant debate. Maybe it's happening in the rest of the country about, how serious is the risk of authoritarianism? We've clearly seen the rise of authoritarianism in a couple of Eastern European countries that we thought were democratic. India, frankly, has had a pretty serious backsliding. It doesn't really count as a free country in the Freedom House ranking anymore. So we definitely see some backsliding toward authoritarianism. And I know we're not going to get into US politics, but there are worries about the United States, frankly. We've been marked down by Freedom House in terms of our political institutions. So there's definitely one group of pundits in Washington who thinks there's a serious risk of authoritarianism, and that really should be just about the only thing we focus on. And then I would say a more dominant view is that US institutions are very robust. We have lots of checks and balances, and there've of course been a little bit of democratic backsliding in some of the countries I mentioned, but our core allies in Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, even Mexico has lots of problems, but it's a core democratic ally of the United States. So I guess I lean toward the more optimistic group, that we're not really at risk of going into some kind of authoritarian period. But I listen to those worrying voices. There are smart people who are very worried.
So I actually recently returned from China just last week after a personal special visit. I'm hearing from the China side the kind of division. There are people reflecting on the price China pay for globalization. They're worried about, their environment polluted. They were the dumping ground. And they were talking about how their culture lost to the Western culture. And so there seems to be, on the China side, they're thinking about the internal cycle. So given how big the economy is, what would China's position on this change the globalization?
Yeah, so when they first came out with that phrase, dual circulation, I didn't really think it had any obvious meaning for an economist. So as I look into it a little bit more, I think there's both a good and a bad interpretation. So the good interpretation is that while China's been a big beneficiary from globalization, it's the biggest trading nation. It's natural for the role of trade to diminish as China has moved to middle income and as it goes higher. Just very simply, in the early stage of reform, China's exports were growing faster than 20% per year. It was an engine of growth. now they're the biggest trader in the world, and there's no way their exports can sustainably grow. And you might hear 1 month data, but you're not seeing sustainable growth of exports or foreign investment anywhere like 20 years ago. And that's just kind of natural. So if what they mean is that they need to rely more on domestic demand, and they also, you know, there are a lot of, you know, they need more social spending, they need more environmental spending, et cetera. So if it's a recognition of changes that would be beneficial for people and make their growth more sustainable, then it's basically a good thing. But it does sound a little bit worrying that has a protectionist element of kind of the international economy is not that important anymore, if that means they're going to deliberately cut themselves off in more sectors, you know, more trade protectionism, more investment restrictions, then that's going to backfire on them. And of course, it'll just make our relationship U.S. China more difficult.
Thank you. We have an audience question. If China is really a neo-mercantilist strategic trader, should the US be too? Isn't that part of the dilemma that Britain faced with the rise of Imperial Germany that led Britain slowly to back away from free trade? How do you work to contain a major strategic trader in a context of rules-oriented liberal economic order?
Great question. So there's no easy answer to that. I do think, you know, as I said, I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was partly aimed at that, to create a bloc, you know, which together would be much bigger than China, and create rules for trade and investment that either China had to match, or frankly, China would end up being left out. And, you know, I think that, and then when you follow that kind of strategy, I think you have to be willing to accept either outcome. If China's not willing to play by the rules of this new agreement, you know, then you just accept that you're not going to have as much economic exchange as you might have had. So you have to sort of stick to your guns. But I do think for the US to be going it alone, first, the worst thing would be is if we try to copy China, because there are a lot of inefficiencies and failures in Chinese industrial policy. So, you know, trying to copy China's industrial policy, that would, I think, be the worst outcome for the US. And then trying to negotiate just one-on-one and get them to change, you know, I would argue we've tried that for a long time and that hasn't worked well. So we really have to build alliances. But to me, that means, you know, new trade and investment agreements. Otherwise, it's just talk.
So for many heartland states, China is not the top trade partner, and there are many, many other partners. But globally, if you think about US, as you mentioned, some sector, we have so much abundance, and while others, we are at a disadvantage. So in your point of view, given the changing economy, what a sector you think globalization is really, really good for US, while others, you know, we're at a disadvantage for globalization?
Well, I think agricultural trade works out well for us. I know it has a lot of controversies. I emphasize that we're a big net food exporter, you know, but we do import certain specialized products. You know, we import avocados in the wintertime in particular, and that's one of the advantages of trade is there's different geographies around the world. I love getting a good mango, you know, at any time of year. So, you know, I think agriculture is a good area. I mean, some of the recent innovations are actually quite interesting. You know, we tend to think of trade aside from agriculture very much around manufactured products, which I've discussed a little, but there is more and more direct trade in services, and there's more value chains developing in services. So recent development is India and the Philippines, you know, have made a lot of progress with essentially being part of the back office of American firms, you know, and like I just had a little renovation project done on my house a few years ago, and you know, one of the architects would would take work at the end of the day and send it to his team in India. And they would continue to work what would be all night for us in the East Coast of the United States. So that's incredibly efficient. So I think if we can liberalize some of the services trade, and often you have all kinds of irrational licenses and restrictions, I do think we would benefit a lot if we freed up some of that. That could be a whole new frontier that, as I see, would be, as I see it, would be mostly win-win. Yeah.
Great. So we have one last question. I'm going to take the liberty, being the moderator, ask a question I want to ask you. When you were in China, I was still a student in China. So me being here is very much a product of globalization. And there's people implication, cultural implication to globalization. So what do you have for our younger generations who want to pursue a global career? What are the implications with this shifting debate around globalization for that generation going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Min. You know, when I was thinking about some of the things I might want to say, it did strike me that for me to jump in right with trade and investment as I did, I think it had a certain logic, but it was also a little bit shallow in a sense that there's so many other aspects of globalization and migration, including temporary migration, students, tourists, that's just economically, that's very important. And I think culturally, it's even more important. So that, to me, that's one of the worst things about this whole COVID-19 pandemic. I haven't traveled internationally for almost 2 years now. I haven't been to China for 2 years. And my advice to young people, what I said to my own children, and my advice to young people is to get out of your comfort zone. And for a bigger country like America, that doesn't automatically mean you have to leave the country. But, there are a lot of interesting places around the world. If you could spend a year, work for a non-governmental organization, building housing for the poor, or just something, kind of really outside of your comfort zone, I think that changes people. I didn't study economics originally. I studied Chinese language and Chinese history at Dartmouth College, and I never took any economics. And then I had a fellowship to go to Taiwan to continue my Chinese studies. And the thing that hit me about Taiwan in 1975, I'm revealing how old I am, was that was when Taiwan was taking off with globalization. That they were the ones who invented the export-oriented growth model, frankly. And so just watching the dynamism, I was living with a Chinese family and seeing their, the factories, the takeoff of exports, it had a big effect on me. And so I ended up completely switching fields. I came back to the US and I went into a PhD program in economics, and I became a professional economist. So I think, get out, and in many cases, that means get out of the United States for a while. It's hard right at this moment, but do something unusual, go somewhere unusual, and it may not, become an important part. It may not have an obvious connection to your future work, but it'll change the way you think about the world.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to welcome back Matt and to provide closing remarks. Thank you so much, Dr. Dollar.
Min, thank you so much. Dr. Dollar, what a treat to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation about, as you said very well, a very, very complex topic that we will be watching for some time to come. We certainly hope that you can join us at some point live and in person in Kansas City. We'll be waiting for you here with barbecue and all sorts of other Kansas City treats. So thank you so much. And Min, a big thank you to you as well for your fine moderating this evening. What a pleasure to work with you and Governor Holden and the USHCA in this way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening. Good night. Bye-bye.
And everybody, we thank you for joining us this evening for this presentation as part of the International Relations Council's Great Decisions Lecture Series. We do have a couple more coming up, and so stay tuned on irckc.org for those programs as well as other upcoming events. And you can visit the U.S. Heartland China Association's website as well. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.